Before the 19th century, there were only a few thousand Jews living in South Africa, most of whom came from England and Germany. Presently, there are approximately 70,000 Jews residing in South Africa, many of whom have made a major impact in many spheres of South African life. People such as Dr. Ali Bacher in sport, Helen Suzman in politics, and, a bit further back, Sammy Marks in industry. Today, the vast majority of South African Jews have ancestral roots leading all the way back to the small shtetls, villages of Lithuania. What makes this Jewish community unique, and to what extent is this uniqueness informed by its origin in this Eastern European country?
He couldn't speak one single word of English, and he spoke Yiddish mainly, and he spoke a little bit of Lithuanian.
My mom came as a baby in arms. I think she was 6 months or 12 months, 18 months old. And they were fleeing the pogroms.
Eden, moest leven. Jews, we must run.
Lithuania, a small area along the Baltic Sea, together with two other Baltic countries, Latvia and Estonia, has been independent from the Soviet Union since 1991. Lithuania is first mentioned in historical sources from the 11th century, and in the 13th century the country was unified into a state. To develop the country in the 14th century, Lithuania gave privileges of profession and freedom of worship to foreigners. For centuries thereafter, Lithuania became a refuge for Jews who had escaped persecutions and pogroms during the Crusades of Western Europe. Initially fairly small, the country developed into a powerful state, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In the 15th century, Lithuania changed from a pagan to Christian state. In many areas, the Jews had equal rights to Christians, permission to work as artisans, to own land and legal protection against intolerance, rare exceptions given the anti-Judaic policies in Europe and Russia at the time. Unified with Poland, Lithuania continued to remain one of the rare privileged countries for Jewish immigrants in Europe. It remained a time of, quote, benevolence for the Jews, apart from massacres by Russian invaders and the growing number of anti-Jewish laws. When, in 1795, Lithuania was incorporated into the Russian Empire, the privileged situation of the Lithuanian Jews came to an end. Lithuania became part of the area referred to as the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were obliged to live. A number of pogroms in the Pale towards the end of the 19th century forced many Jews to immigrate. Those remaining in Lithuania suffered more and more repressive measures.
Russia never had Jewish population. They didn't know what to do with them. And what kind of people they are. And this was for the first time that Russia got one of the largest communities of the Jews in the world.
The Tsarist Empire imposes all kinds of disabilities on all minorities. And because more than half of the population of the Tsarist Empire are minorities, everybody feels disadvantaged. Usually we would think in terms of rights for everybody, in terms of universal rights. However, we have the situation in the Tsarist Empire when there are only special rights. There are no universal rights. So people in every field of all kinds of beliefs, calls, and political persuasion feel disadvantaged in the Tsarist Empire. So they try to find better living. So the Jews, as everybody else, then, tried to get out of the Tsarist Empire.
About 50% of Jews in that time lived in villages, not in towns. And they had very useful professions there, like blacksmiths, millers, tailors, glassmakers. And here comes modernity when peasants don't need blacksmiths anymore. They are buying nails made on factories. They don't need Jewish horsemen anymore because railroads are built.
So all this created the atmosphere for people to emigrate.
The Jews began to arrive from Eastern Europe in the 1880s, and they came from Eastern Europe, particularly from Lithuania and from Latvia next door. They came because of persecution in Eastern Europe, because they were second-class citizens within the Tsarist Empire, but particularly because of very difficult economic conditions.
Economic immigrants, they were looking for the possibility to go elsewhere. They would go to Brazil, they would go to Argentina, and they would go to South Africa.
At this time, the great mineral discoveries of 1886 were taking place in South Africa, making South Africa an attractive and prosperous destination for Jewish immigrants leaving Lithuania.
One of the most known Litvaks in South Africa, Simon Marks, did that road in the middle of 19th century. The land were just started diamond mining, the gold rush.
He makes a great fortune together with a cousin called Isaac Lewis in South Africa, and word goes home to Lithuania that one of their own, a Lithuanian Jew, has done wonderfully well.
Another thing is that Simon Marks had a lot of enterprises, and he prefers to have his own people to work for him. So of course he is paying their tickets also.
And South Africa is enormously attractive for these people, the economic opportunities, and they're also being treated decently. They're being treated like human beings. They're no longer second-class citizens in South Africa. So it's seen as a very exciting possibility.
But those who made that trip, they were very strong. They were prepared to take everything to get better life. And that made the Simon Marks and other careers. They were really prepared to do a lot and to lose a lot.
But also the big part of immigrants to South Africa were of leftist persuasion. It's interesting, it's not very well researched history, but it's an interesting history which, needs, the students of their own, to study.
Many Jews from Lithuania began to immigrate to South Africa from the Eastern European country in the late 1800s. Not only was there economically motivated immigration of Jews to South Africa, but politically left-wing immigrants chose to move to South Africa above other destinations.
I believe my mother's mother had actually been a political activist against the Tsar, but because she had fair here, when she was on a train and the Cossacks were searching the train for agitators, a friendly Cossack allowed her to escape.
Many of the Lithuanian Jews who arrived in South Africa in the late 19th century were fleeing repression in Tsarist Russia and so were keenly aware of injustice. Those who came after also faced anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Resultantly, Litvaks have often striven for social justice for all. This can be seen in the likes of Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Helen Suzman, present-day Tony Leon, and Judge Albie Sachs.
From 1880 to roughly 1914, we have this huge wave of Lithuanian immigrants arriving. There are 40,000 of them approximately, and they are the core of the modern South African Jewish community.
My paternal grandfather, Coleman Mayer Goldstein, came to South Africa in 1899. So I think that whole journey of the way he moved from Lithuania via England to Oudtshoorn to Johannesburg was typical very much of the Lithuanian Jews who came through to South Africa without necessarily having a particular trade.
They could rely very much on the support of family and of people who come from the same town of Landman, from the same sort of area. So there's a whole network that they could depend on. So if you arrived, for example, as a young person, what you would generally do is go off often to a small country town and you go and work for somebody. You'd be a store clerk. And while you were a store clerk, you would learn business practices. So you would learn sufficient a language and you'd learn the business practices. And it was quite a hospitable environment to come into because it was an environment where the economy was growing and at the same time the economy was highly underdeveloped.
He, as many others, became what is known as a trier. It's a Yiddish word, a South Africanized Yiddish word, where everybody tries to do what they can to make a living. And many South African Jews, Lithuanian Jews or Litvaks as they're known, went through the same process. A lot of them moving to shtetls where they became what is known as smoser, or smos is originally I think a Dutch word, which is a peddler as it were. But often moving from peddling into general dealers or into farming.
My mom came as a baby in arms. I think she was 6 months or 12 months, 18 months old, with her mother from Lithuania. Her dad had come here before that. And that would have been around about 1906. My dad, I think, was 6 or 7 or 8 when he came, roughly the same time. He was a little bit older than my mom. And they were fleeing the pogroms.
My father's side of the family came from Kovna. My father's mother perished in one of the pogroms of Kovna, one of the onslaughts on the Jewish population. They came here at the turn of the century. It must have been, I don't know, about 1910 or thereabouts. He had no formal education at all. Anyway, they established a little haberdashery shop in Woodstock, in Solari Road, Woodstock, known as Bagrams. That shop exists to this very day.
They went to my mother's family to Pretoria, and my grandfather, Zayda, was a tailor, and he became a football referee, and very secular, very warm person, part of public life. His wife became more and more withdrawn and religious. She was also good at sewing, and my mom told me how her mother would make her very good dresses because she wanted her to catch a good man. In the end, she caught Solly Sachs, who had no visual sense at all and was much more captivated by her spirit and idealism than by any dress that she might have been wearing. Solly's sisters worked in clothing factories. He was in and out of school. He grew up going in and out of school. He worked at a very early age and never really completed his schooling, and became a trade union organizer, general secretary of the Garment Workers Union.
They brought with them a great deal of cultural baggage to South Africa. They came from a traditional society, but a traditional society which in the late 19th century was changing in itself. It wasn't the traditional society of 200 years before that. It was a society which was rapidly modernizing.
So the Lithuanian influence was very direct for them. My mom used to take her parents to the Jewish theatre, and they would speak Yiddish at home. But by the time I came onto the scene, that had disappeared.
The shtetl supported a rich and complex infrastructure of cultural, religious and educational institutions. While the shtetl esteemed learning, the migrants were not the learned. The more professional, the more skilled, the more affluent, the more established and the more pious tended to remain at home.
Understand that the Jews of Latvia of Woodstock at the time weren't Orthodox Jews in the sense that we know it. They were very committed Jews, and it was like transferring a Jewish community of Kovna to Cape Town, which I call a shtetl, you know, a little entity of Jews that conducted their own affairs. But the thing with Lithuanian Jews, there was a great ethic amongst Jews to help one another.
There was a great sense of responsibility and urgency amongst the early arrivals in South Africa to build a shul. So you found Jews that came to South Africa, to the shtetlach, so to speak, of South Africa, to the small dorps in the Cape, and later on as they moved into Natal and the Transvaal, where straight away they would establish a Chevra Kedisha. That would be an organization to bury the dead. And there would be social organizations that would be there to take care of the poor and those people that needed assistance in various aspects of their lives.
Vilna was an incredible place of learning, of culture, of rabbinical giants. The Vilna Gaon. And I think some of those traits were brought with them to South Africa. I think the fact that the South African Jewish community is what it is today in terms of its infrastructure, its commitment to Jewish education, to health and welfare, its keen sense of community is very much a part of Lithuania as it was in those days. In fact, sitting in a shul in Lithuania and sitting in a shul in Cape Town, you could be sitting in the same type of synagogue. They look the same.
With the arrival of the Litvak Jews, tensions began to rise with the already assimilated Anglo-Jews. The Eastern European Jews were contemptuous of the English Jews, who they felt had discarded their religious practices, where the synagogue was less a place of regular worship and study, but rather a symbol of the community's social ambitions, and it represented a westernized Jewish community's search for social acceptance in a Gentile world. The Anglo-Jews felt ashamed of the Litvak Jews' behavior and living conditions, but felt a responsibility to help them irrespective of their feelings. But as time moved on, the tensions started to disappear, and the Eastern European Jews acculturated and anglicized themselves, sending their children to government schools and only speaking English at home. Because the Litvaks outnumbered the Anglo-Jews, they quickly assumed positions of leadership within the Jewish community.
Well, they were very adaptive, and what they did was to, in fact, combine what they had brought with them with the new. So they keep a lot of the customs, the tunes, they enjoy particularly the foods. Food is terribly important in any immigrant story, and food is your Madeleine. It's what reminds you of the old country. It reminds you of your parents and of your own childhood. So that's one of the very important things that you retain are the traditional foods. So the traditional foods of Jewish Lithuania are very much present in South Africa and are continued right through to the present day.
Lithuanian Jewish culture, I don't know how it comes through to me. I like going to New York Bagels because of the pierogi and the chicken soup. I like herring. I'm not crazy about gefilte fish, but I love chopped liver. So there's certain tastes like that, and tegelach are not like my Auntie Rosie used to make.
I think a lot of us have very similar habits, eating habits. Our whole social being is defined because of great-grandparents. I mean, this is great-great-grandparent. Probably eats very similar food to what we eat, and it's a strange phenomenon.
Coming from a background that valued education and hard work, it was relatively easy for the Litvaks to adapt to their new home, integrating and assimilating with South Africans, but yet holding on to their Jewish identity.
They weren't hugely learned. That's the rather interesting thing about South African Jewry, is that the truly learned, the yeshiva bochers, the people who were going to make a career of that sort, were not the natural immigrants. And so when they come to South Africa, you don't have re-established in South Africa that sort of deep culture of learning, at least for much of the early 20th century when the immigrants arrive. South Africa is not a great centre, certainly is not a great centre of Jewish learning. Jewish learning remains to a very large extent in the old world still. Those people remain behind. But they are very traditional, they're very committed to a sense of Jewishness.
There were 300 Jewish families in Woodstock, Salt River. It was an interesting life in Woodstock. There was a synagogue, or shul as we called it, in Argyle Street, the bottom of Argyle and Lower Albert Road. 300 Jewish families. And that was our social life of the time. We children were so happy. The shul was our community service, community centre, and it was our home. It was our social life, not only for the children, but for the adults as well. We were all poor, but we somehow survived, and we were happy.
First World War intervenes, and the First World War is highly disruptive in countries like Lithuania. Jewish communities are being very, very badly affected by the war itself. And of course, immigration stops. There's no possibility of immigration.
After First World War, Jewish communities in this part of the world once more became very poor. For a few years, majority of Lithuanian towns were empty. They left Russian Empire and coming back to independent Lithuania. And when you're coming back without a thing, you have to start from the beginning. So once more, the new immigration wave from Lithuania in 20s and 30s was very huge.
This upsets a lot of people in South Africa. There's a strong anti-alien sentiment in South Africa. People don't want these foreign-looking immigrants coming into the country. It's obviously a combination of hostility to aliens and of anti-Semitism, plain old-fashioned anti-Semitism. And in 1930, a measure is introduced, a statute is introduced, effectively stopping immigration from Eastern Europe. So that is really the terminal point for immigration from Eastern Europe. Jews continue to arrive subsequently, but they're Jews essentially from Central Europe, from Germany. And that continues into the 1930s until a further measure is introduced, halting immigration from from Central Europe.
The Jewish community in South Africa had swelled from a few thousand in the late 1800s as a result of the 40,000 economic migrants from Lithuania and Eastern Europe. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 exacerbated anti-Semitism and prejudice against Jews and other minorities. On the eve of World War II, approximately 240,000 Jews lived in Lithuania. In Vilna alone, there were over 50,000 Jews, 100 synagogues and prayer houses.
I was born on the 25th of January 1932 in Postville. My father tells a story. There was a person by the name of Vladimir Jabotinsky who was a revisionist, who was a right-winger. And he traveled Eastern Europe. He came, must have been Postville, and he spoke from the back of a train. and his famous words, "Eden ihr müsst laufen," Jews, we must run. In 1935, I had my mother's brother was in South Africa. He, in those days, was a rich man. And he decided to bring my father to South Africa. We left Bosville in either September or October 1938. We came to Southampton. We had booked, or my uncle had booked, onto the Cape Town Castle. We arrived in Cape Town. We got onto a train to Joburg.
Once the Germans' army moved into the Baltic states, which was June 1941, they brought with them something called an Einsatzgruppen. And this was a mobile killing squad. And their task was to round up the communities in the small villages of Lithuania, in the towns, and to actually herd them outside of these towns and cities even, and to murder them. And they started this process almost immediately. Now, they were a relatively small group, so one has to ask the question, well, how did they manage to do it? And the way they managed to do it was to enlist the assistance of the local militia and local civilians. So these were people who volunteered to join these groups, these mobile killing squads, and they did most of the work. They were the people that handled the machine guns, they were the people that supervised the movement of the people, they were the people that actually herded the people into the pits or the storage tanks or wherever they are found.
When Lithuania was invaded by the Nazis, they were more cruel, the Lithuanians were more cruel than the Nazis themselves. But the church exhorted, the primate of the Catholic Church in Lithuania exhorted the Nazis to kill harder and faster. And that's how the Ninth Fort came about during that period, that awful period of extermination of the Jews of Eastern Europe, Russia and Eastern Europe. That Ninth Fort were the killing fields. There were big trenches, and the Jews were lined up beside the trenches, and the gunmen had their positions on top, and they mowed down the Jews as they stood there, and they fell into the spit. It was a horrible, horrible period of Jewish history.
This was a terrible shock for the Lithuanian Jews, because after all, they'd lived in Lithuania for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they had built up relationships with their Lithuanian fellow Catholics and the rest of the Lithuanian population, and had good relationships with them to a large extent. So this was a shock to the Jewish population, and for many of them, I don't think they even realized what was happening, that there was such strong anti-Semitism which was latent, which was boiling underneath the sentiment of Lithuanian population, combined with the fact that there was a tremendous anti-Bolshevik feeling. And the occupation by the Soviets of Lithuania had been a major problem for many of the Lithuanian population, and they saw, and that's, though it's not true, they saw that the Jews were complicit in supporting the Soviet occupation, and so they saw the Nazis as in fact their liberators, and they supported their initiatives.
I think there was a very significant proportion of families left behind. I think for a larger part of the Lithuanian Jewry who settled in South Africa, had the children in South Africa, they had mothers and fathers and siblings in the country. And you can see it in the response to the Holocaust when news arrived in South Africa of what had happened to the Jewry of Lithuania, which was practically obliterated during the war. Lithuanian Jewry was devastated by the murders of the Holocaust. When that news reached South Africa, it sent a shockwave through South African Jewry. South African Jewry was plunged into the deepest mourning because it was so immediate.
After the mass destruction of Lithuanian Jewry during the Holocaust, the taproots of South African Jewry are severed, and essentially the South African Jewry lives off the initial 40,000 strong immigration and the further immigration after the First World War.
After the Shoah, we really cannot speak about Lithuanian Jews. Lithuanian Jewry was destroyed almost completely. And survivors remained in Poland from concentration camps and so on, waiting for any possibility to go as far as possible. As far from that bloody Europe, as far from that bloody Lithuania, where they lost everything and all.
My mother was a survivor of the Shoah. She was part of the Bielski partisan group in the forests, and she remained a victim for the rest of her life when she came to South Africa. And for me, as a random sample of one, my mother and her family represent a very sad and tragic story of, on the one hand, destruction, loss, mourning, tragedy, and constant recall of the past, unable to escape it. The what-ifs, the onlys, the buts, the regrets, perpetual state of angst in many ways, and yet somehow being able to overcome their tremendous adversity and make some sort of life for themselves in South Africa.
This is the gravestone of my grandparents. My grandfather died in the year 1912. He was 1925. He was a very religious man. Beneath him, or besides him, is the stone for my grandmother, Millie. He was a very religious man. He was a reverend, so-called, and very orthodox.
Fortunately, a lot of the history has always been told to us, and it's always, every year we've heard the same stories, every year we have the same discussions, and every year we come back here. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we come back here every single year, and we come to this same spot. We always come to put a stone on the grave, and then we hear the story from my father. He tells us. This year, in fact, I brought my son with me. So it gets passed down the generations, so that each time we'll bring the son to come and stand here and have a look and hear the story and listen to our background. It's a very humble background, and basically we come from peasants. And the point is that you must understand that where you come from, and that will tell you where you're going to.
Modern Zionism emerged in the late 19th century at a time of widespread nationalistic stirrings in Europe and was transported to South Africa by the Jewish immigrants.
Another thing about it is its distinctive Zionism, its commitment to Zionism. It's always been a very Zionist community, much more so than English Jewry. There was really a division around Zionism for a very large part of the first part of the 20th century. That division was never strongly the case in South Africa. It's another thing that gives it its feature.
It's interesting from a political point of view because of my involvement with the Board of Deputies. It's a strange community, but most of us, 90% of us, are Orthodox. Although we don't practice Orthodox Jewry, most of us don't, but we are Orthodox. I mean, I go to an Orthodox shul, I'm involved in all Orthodox activity. And also, 90% of us are Zionist, very strongly Zionist. But it's a contradiction because a lot of us won't ever live there in Israel. I'll always live here. I'm not planning to go live in Israel. But you say something bad about Israel and immediately my hackles are raised and I'm really angry and I'll write letters to newspapers and shout at people and shout on radio stations and whatever. So I'm very strongly Zionist. A passion is Zionism.
While predominant in numbers, these Eastern European Jews did not determine the direction of South African Orthodoxy. Local circumstances, including the distance from larger centers and economic necessities, played an important part here, eroding the piety of ordinary congregants and modifying religious practice.
And the passion is also orthodoxy. And yet I'm sad to say I'm a person that would drive on the Shabbos. If I saw my rabbi driving on a Shabbos, I think I'd die. I'd probably fall over and die immediately, but it's quite kosher for me to do it. And it's a paradox. I can't explain it. And I think that we all like that. It's a strange thing about the Litvaks. But then you also see strange reports about our children. 90% of the school-going children, Jewish school-going children, are at the Jewish day school. And the Jewish day schools are Orthodox. And I wouldn't dream of making the kid go to another school. And all of us are feeling exactly the same way. And it's something that is only explained because of our common background.
The community worked very hard at establishing a whole range of institutions, educational institutions, religious institutions, social and cultural and charitable institutions, which had the effect of keeping the community very solid, coherent, community-minded. So it is a remarkable community, remains a remarkable community despite the reverse immigration that's taken place in the last few decades.
And the cornerstone of our lives has been the Holocaust, believe it or not. And it's been something in helping us define our personalities. And it's because of this type of history, because of this background, that we become communal-minded and we get very involved. So I've been involved with the Board of Deputies, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies now for the last 22 years.
Most of the once strong Jewish community of Lithuania left between the late 1800s and World War II, many coming to South Africa. Today in Vilna, the capital city, you will find a small community made up mostly of old people.
The people who survived through Holocaust, it was very important for them to stick together in one or another way. Still, the past was very important, and it was an important part of their identification. And finding each other, being loyal to each other and, having communal bounds.
Ich bin geblieben mit meinem Vater, weil wir sind entlaufen in Russland in 1941, dem ersten Tag vom Krieg. Der Gerl von unserer Mischproche ist derselbe wie die alle jüdische Jiden-Elite.
I would say up to 1990, this was the most important aspect. And then after 1990, after the Lithuanian independence, naturally you have different process coming. I mean, you have institutionalization of communal life. You have communal institutions. In this building where we are right now, there are, to my knowledge, if I'm not wrong, about 30 organizations registered. So it's a striving communal life in a sense.
The The majority of Jews live in Vilna, 3,500. We have got another 500 living in Kaunas. And then we have got Jews in another 29 cities and towns of Lithuania. Most of the younger people see their life and their future in Lithuania. So it's not that it's only a community of people who are Holocaust survivors. They have got also their kids and their grandchildren. The big hope for the Jews of Lithuania are the young people.
And why would someone want to stay in a small community with a tragic history and with an uncertain future? And I asked several people in Vilna this question, young people in particular, the future of the community. And they said to me, if we don't stay here and protect the past and protect the history and the heritage and remember what happened here and be the purveyors, the missionaries, the messengers to future generations, it's going to be forgotten. It's going to be obliterated. Joint made an active decision to help those Jewish people, our people, and then to help young families reconnect, young people reconnect to their Jewish roots.
In the late 20th century, a movement began in which people started looking into their family heritage, tracing their roots back as far as they could, and visiting their place of birth or ancestry to gain a better understanding of where they came from.
I think my interest really started with my grandmother, my mother's mother, Bela Rosenstein. She lived with us, and during my childhood I used to come home from school and talk to her about her childhood. And she was born in a place called Mažeikiai in the north of Lithuania, close to the Latvian border. And all stories of her childhood and about life in the shtetl. And that really evoked pictures for me of what life must have been like in Lithuania. And for me, that opened a world which was really one-dimensional. It was a world that I saw in terms of black and white photographs that I saw in my Boba's photograph albums. And all of a sudden it came to life. It now had color, it now had depth.
I remember the town where I was brought up till the age of 6, the house, the shul, the rabbi, etc. I also remember Zaydekan, where we used to go during the summer months on a holiday, on a dacha.
The one thing I'd never seen was my dad getting quite as emotional, and I remember there were certain places in Lithuania where he had memories of cousins or of his aunts, and these were all people who perished. And it was very interesting and very sad to see someone who had to come to terms with their memories and the people not being there anymore.
I knew from past experience that Zaydekan it's a forest, and that was the killing fields of the Jews. But the most striking feature of any of these killing fields is the dead silence. You came there in a forest, you would expect there were birds, there would be something there. This was dead, quiet. When we walked through, you could hear your footsteps. It was so quiet. And this gave one a very eerie feeling.
And Abby and I went to Kovna at the 9th Fort and surrounding areas. It was a most inspiring, a sad, but a most inspiring experience of my life. And I'm now totally fulfilled that I have now understood what my grandparents' lives were like.
It was wonderful to see where one's family had come from and to get insight into their previous existence before they became the more familiar South African Jewish immigrants.
Having visited Vilna a few times because of my work at the Joint Distribution Committee, and seeing for myself firsthand the place where my mother lived and trying to imagine the happiness and the lifestyle and what it was like to be a young Jew living in the 1920s, 1930s in Vilna, and then going to the Ponari forests and knowing that her family was wiped out in the forests, saying the Kaddish there, makes it very, very difficult to reflect on one's past, and yet professionally to see the spark of Jewish life, the Pinteler Yid, come up to the surface, and to have a regeneration of Jewish life is something very, very special and meaningful.
Although the South African Jewish community has its roots in the shtetls of Lithuania, South Africa, the land which provided it wings, has become more than just a place of temporary dwelling. Those that settled in South Africa have come together as one of the most unique and unified Jewish communities in the world, contributing to the broader society, while, for the most part, maintaining a strong Jewish identity. They don't long for the days of their ancestral homeland, or Daheim, but do remember it, and those that were left behind, with fondness and an acknowledgement of the sacrifices they made to allow the later generations a better life.